For a time, it was the queen of the skies. And although it never fired a shot in anger, the B-57 Stratojet occupies a place as one of the pivotal jet bombers in aviation history. Here is the story of the jet and the men who flew it. That story began for many men on the plains of Kansas. Here near Wichita is McConnell Air Force Base, known as one of the toughest schools in the Air Training Command. The men who came here learned to fly one of the hottest airplanes of its time, the Boeing B-57.
Gentlemen, on behalf of the 3520th Combat Crew Training Wing, we welcome you to McConnell Air Force Base. Now, you're here for an intensive training period to qualify you as crew members in the B-57 airplane. Now, to acquaint you with some of the history of the Stratojet, we take you back to 1943, to the dark days of World War II.
At that time, the B-17 was the mainstay of the Army Air Corps. The Super Fortress, the B-29, was just starting in production. At the request of the Air Force, the Boeing company began studies on the next generation of big bombers. This would be a bomber with something new at the time, the jet engine. These studies, thousands of research hours, and exhaustive wind tunnel tests led to a six-jet swept-wing airplane. On December 17, 1947, exactly 44 years from the day the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk, the XB-47 took to the skies. That flight sparked a revolution. Jet-powered airplanes were definitely here to stay. By early 1948, the Air Force had decided it wanted Stratojets. Lots of them. That decision led to reopening of the government B-29 plant in Wichita, Kansas. Two years later, in March of 1950, the dream came to life as the standard production models began to roll off the line. Within 4 years, 100 B-47s had been built. The first production model was not the end. A continuous program of development kept the Stratojet in front. From the current model was developed the RB-47, a reconnaissance model. The radical new design was powered by six 6,000-pound thrust J-46 GE-25 engines, which are grossly underpowered by today's standards. But still, it gave the Stratojet a maximum performance of 606 miles per hour at 16,000 feet. Still, the B-47 often needed help getting airborne under conditions of extreme weight. And that's where JATO bottle thrust provided an additional 33,000 pounds of thrust.
So, gentlemen, that's the airplane. Now, you'll learn that she flies by teamwork. A combat crew of 3, aircraft commander, pilot, and observer. Now, you pilots may just as well regard the observer as the blue chip passenger. When you're coming in over the target, it's his baby. When your observer calls for a sight-in station, all this vast program, all this effort, is no better than the observer's skill in those few seconds over the target. Now, your instructors here at McConnell are prepared to qualify you as B-47 combat crew teams. Now, it's up to you.
And for that day and age, it was a tall order. The training to fly a B-47 was as complex as any in the history of the Air Force. A seemingly endless mass of systems and procedures were involved. And with only a crew of 3, teamwork was vital. It was needed to understand the 27 miles of electrical wiring, the 1,000 electronics tubes, hydraulics, compressors, valves, and gauges without end. The observer was probably the most important crew member in terms of putting bombs on the target. He had to learn about radar and the key, this small handle which actually controlled the bomber while it was on its final bomb run. Then the electronics took over, helping to compute all the variables for an accurate bomb run. Primitive by today's standards of laser and optical guided bombs. But for the time, it was the best thing going. After weeks of intensive effort, it was time for the crew to solo the airplane. More often than not, the outcome was predictably routine. After all, the Air Force usually sent its best to train in what was the hottest bomber in the world. McConnell turned them out en masse for assignments all over the world. B-47s were deployed from Europe to the Far East and Africa. To achieve and maintain a high degree of readiness, then as now, simulated missions were flown under rigorous conditions. And our now operational crew is quickly thrown into the fray.
Control Tower, this is Air Force 1956.
Ready for takeoff, over.
Air Force 1956.
Cleared for takeoff.
Roger, coming up on power.
Although it was heavier than any World War II bomber, including the B-29, the B-47 was classified as a medium bomber. In the sky, it was as sleek and capable as anything in the air.
Gear up.
Gear coming up.
The B-47 could climb at 4,600 feet per minute and had a range of over 4,000 miles. But like any jet, it was very thirsty, and refueling was a common practice.
Tom, our scheduled refueling time is 2400. It's about 6 minutes to go.
Where's that tanker airplane?
Hold your present heading. I have the tanker on radar.
You should have him in sight now.
Roger, I have the tanker in sight. Nice going, Tom. We're going in right on the button. Sam, get set for refueling contact.
Roger, Cliff. Refueling checklist complete. Slipway door open.
Get your credit card ready. She's all yours.
Okay, Sam. Watch our fuel distribution. I'm ready to contact.
At the time, for security reasons, aerial refueling contacts in the Strategic Air Command were handled in radio silence between tanker and bomber. This delicate maneuver became so routine in the Air Force that even at the time, a refueling was taking place every 3.5 minutes, around the clock, somewhere in the world.
We've just about got our load. Okay, pressure disconnect.
Refueled and ready to fly through the long night to the target, a sleeping city 7 miles below. At dawn, exactly on schedule, bombs away.
Steady on 045. We're on autopilot.
Roger. I have the target on radar. Center the PDI and give me second station.
The PDI is centered. You have second station.
Roger. I have it.
Time to go, 180 seconds. This was the payoff. 3 men, a machine, and the skills of thousands of people funneled into a few critical seconds.
You have 30 seconds before bomb release.
20 seconds.
10,
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
As it turned out, the B-47 never did drop bombs in anger. But many a contrail curved through the world's skies as a symbol of the readiness of the Strategic Air Command. And the men who flew the B-47 will always remember that it opened the door for jet bombers in the U.S. Air Force. That role will never be forgotten.
It was 35 years ago that go-ahead was given to build the B-58 Hustler. From the start, it was apparent this airplane would be a record setter. Technology instantly took several giant strides. The Hustler has mid-mounted delta wings, which was quite an innovation at the time. Because of the high temperatures associated with Mach 2 flight, skin panels were made of aluminum glass fiber honeycomb between layers of metal. The bomber also made the first use of the escape capsule concept. The crew sat in individual capsules that could be ejected in an emergency. That allowed for ejection at supersonic speed. The Hustler was armed with a 20-millimeter Vulcan cannon in the tail and a special pod under the airplane, which was used to carry nuclear or conventional bombs. The pod also carried fuel and could be jettisoned once it was empty. But the main feature of the B-58 was speed. Powered by 4 J79 GE-1 engines, it could cruise at nearly 1,500 miles per hour for nearly 3,000 miles. The Hustler started right out breaking records. During the course of its career, the B-58 won the Thompson, Blériot, Bendix, Mackay, and Harmon trophies for outstanding flight performance. It set 14 world records in international competition. For example, this flight from Texas to California at nearly the speed of sound with the plane never more than 500 feet above the ground. Low-level penetration at high speed is accepted practice today. At this time, however, this was really something. In SAC combat competition, a crew from Carswell Air Force Base scrambled, started engines, and got wheels rolling in 2 minutes and 10 seconds, half the time required for other bombers of the time. Later, special courses were set up, and the B-58 broke record after record for speed. The next step was to go for altitude records, and those too fell to the Hustler. In this case, 16.5 miles high, beating marks set by the Soviets. The next world records fell as the B-58 dashed from Los Angeles to New York and back to Los Angeles in 4 hours and 41 minutes. Then it was a non-stop flight from Carswell Air Force Base to Paris. They called this one the Lindy Hop, with the Hustler stopping on the exact spot where the Spirit of St. Louis came to rest. The need for a high-speed weapons delivery system is being met today with the B-1B. But the place in history held by the B-58 Hustler is secure. It was the first of its kind, and some would argue, still one of the best.
It's a dramatic new day in the world of strategic arms. Since the 50s, the U.S. Air Force bombers like this B-52 have been on alert, poised to respond in an instant to carry nuclear weapons to targets in the Soviet Union. But as of October 1991, the world took a step back from living on the nuclear brink. President George Bush, in an unprecedented move, unilaterally called for the U.S. Air Force to stand down from its nuclear alert status. The Strategic Air Command has about 280 bombers at 12 bases, and at any given time, 40 of them have been kept on alert, fueled and armed with nuclear weapons. In addition, production of a new nuclear standoff missile, which would have been carried by the aging B-52, will be canceled. For now, a conventional arms mission will continue for the B-52s. And just in case the world does take a turn away from peace, the alert status can be restored in as little as 24 hours. There is one aircraft today that flies when others cannot fly. It accomplishes missions at night, in bad weather, and with a larger payload than most other aircraft. And it goes about its routine on the front lines of the free world. It is beyond challenge, one of the finest aircraft ever built. And it is doing a job no other in the NATO alliance can do, now or in the foreseeable future. It was designated the F-111 by the U.S. Air Force in the early 1960s. Designed as a night, all-weather, terrain-following bomber, the F-111 carries out its assignments under any circumstances, any time, any place. Let's look at the early days of this special bird. The F-111 was activated in the late 60s. You see, the first 50 years of aviation history had seen military aircraft evolving in a predictable sequence. One airplane rapidly and logically following another, each pushing the other into obsolescence. But the F-111 was one of the first to break that cycle. Few could have foreseen at the time of its development that a highlight in aviation history was being written. Originally, military planners hoped the F-111 could serve as an interim step for U.S. bomber forces. And now it appears the airplane will be called upon to be a part of U.S. military aviation for a 50-year span. The F-111 is a two-seat, all-weather attack aircraft with derivatives ranging from the RF-111C reconnaissance aircraft to the FB-111. The airplane was never given an official name, but Air Force pilots took one look at that long anteater-like nose and nicknamed the plane the Aardvark. But don't let the rather docile title fool you. This anteater has teeth, sharp teeth. When the first Aardvark was flown in 1964, it represented an entire series of firsts in military aircraft. The first use of swing wings, the first use of afterburning turbofan engines, and the first use of a terrain-following radar that allowed for low-level bombing in adverse weather and at night. One of the most important basing locations for the F-111s today is in England. From RAF Lakenheath and Upper Heyford, the F-111 represents the most powerful offensive strike force in NATO. Hardened shelters protect a total of 8 squadrons of Aardvarks. These are the very planes that performed the daring U.S. bombing raid on Libya. The F-111 can execute its bombing runs at 200 feet or below in any kind of weather, day or night. Perhaps as proof of their respect for the aircraft, the Soviets have always asked that the F-111 be included in any strategic arms limitations talks. A typical mission for the European-based F-111s may begin with a scramble mission. With a precision practiced year-round, the crew will have the aircraft ready for flight in just minutes. As usual, the weather is only incidental to the mission. Once the aircraft has been committed, rain, fog, sleet, none of these conditions can stop it. The aardvark goes with full afterburners. More than 50,000 pounds of thrust will propel it to supersonic speeds, despite the weight of over 50 tons. In the air, the plane can race along at Mach 2.5 to deliver a payload to targets well over 1,000 miles away. As was proven in Libya, they can go even further with aerial refueling. Target coordinates and navigational information are programmed into an onboard computer. While the aircraft is still out of hostile radar range, the pilot can select automatic terrain following and go in under the radar beams that seek him out. Accuracy of the system has been proven time and time again in Air Force bombing competitions and in Libya, where individual buildings were bombed at night and at high speed.
The airplane is unique. There isn't another jet in the world, either free or Warsaw Pact, that can do what it can do. It's a very potent weapon system, and it has the ability to strike the entire spectrum of targets that the theater commander would want to strike if we ever had to go to war.
This is the main deterrent to the Soviets. Basically, I would say that our job is in time of war for deep penetration to do the utmost damage to the enemy as we possibly can. Low level, high speed, maximum proficiency, accurate bombing.
Along with a reputation for mission effectiveness and survivability, the F-111 has the added advantage of being one of the most cost-effective airplanes in the inventory. Experience has shown that other types of interdiction aircraft have to have tanker airplanes tagging along. Also, electronic support airplanes, command and control planes, forward air control and fighter escort, as well as rotary-winged rescue forces. But the F-111 works alone, doing a tough job better than any other plane in the Air Force. Historians note that the F-111 started its career steeped in controversy over its role and capabilities. But the questions and concerns have been answered. And today, there is only praise for the aardvark. Even as a still life, it is sculpture that is alive with motion. The F-86 Sabre. This is the shape that was meant to slice through the skies. Conceived from the start to be the ultimate expression of what a fighter plane is all about. It's difficult to believe the origins of the Sabre date back more than 40 years ago. But this is no museum piece. No, this Sabre lives. For years now, air show crowds have thrilled to the sight of this pristine example of America's flying history. And yet the story behind what you see here is more impressive than you might imagine. That this Sabre is flying today is due to the sweat, tears, and yes, even the blood of one man. His name is Ben Hall.
Well, of course, it had been my dream, even when I got out of service, to fly the 86, because it was just, seemed to be the ultimate aircraft at that time, and matter of fact, it's still at this time as far as I'm concerned, because it's just a Cadillac.
Ben flew P-47s and P-51s in the years following World War II. He got out of the service just as the F-86 was coming online. He never forgot its sleek shape and thought to himself, someday, maybe. But the sleek, polished example you see here is a far cry from the way things started for Ben Hall. This is what the airplane looked like when it was rescued from oblivion in the hot summer sun of Central California.
A friend of mine ran across it down in Fresno, California. And he called me, mentioned it to me, and my first reaction was, well, you crazy? What am I going to do with a jet, you know? And, of course, then a couple of weeks later, I was thinking about it at night. I said, what the heck, it's something to play with. And I guess, like I say, we never really went into it with, boy, we're going to get this done. But as we went along, it looked like we might make it.
From this point, it took more than 10,000 hours of work and countless moments of frustration to bring the Sabre back to life. Initially, Ben and his volunteer friends were not even sure it was possible.
I don't know, a person would never dream that you could put it together, but it was something that we could, play with during the weekends initially. But as we got farther into it, I could see that I either had to finish it or forget it. And fortunately, we were able to finish it.
There were only 554 of the A-model Sabres made, but fortunately, total Sabre production numbered in the thousands. That does not include all the examples made by other countries, such as Canada. Still, it is a vintage airplane, and parts are not available at your local pilot's shop.
Amazingly enough, there was only about 2 items that were difficult to find. One was a casting that was missing from the airplane. It was peculiar to this particular block number of airplanes. And we did quite a bit of searching, but we did come up with one. And initially, tailpipes were very scarce, but we came across a couple of those, so that worked out good too.
And there were personal setbacks as well, including the death of 2 of the original restoration crew.
There was initially 3 of us involved, 2 of my good friends, and about a year and a half into the project, coming back from Reno, and they were in one of my T6s, and something happened. They hit a snag and killed them both. So that really, sets you back.
There was also the problem of getting a civilian registration for an F-86 Sabre. Let's just say it took an Herculean effort.
And we spent a year and 10 months corresponding, phone calls, 35 phone calls for Washington, D.C., trying to get this thing going. And like I say, a year and 10 months later, we came up with the registration, so it wasn't easy there either.
But the hard work did pay off. The airplane finally rolled out in a darker paint scheme than it has today. Of course, the first flight is a moment that will never be forgotten by Ben or any of the other volunteers.
My first flight, it's hard to describe after waiting all the 25 years, you might say, and then all the work we put into it, knowing just about everything that's going on. So it was quite a thrill and apprehensive combined.
From that point, the airplane went through a number of repaints before settling on the brilliant silver coat that adorns it today.
Go ahead.
Now began a new struggle for Ben Hall. It turned out to be nearly as difficult to keep the airplane flying as it was to restore it. Jet fuel is expensive and sponsors are few and far between. It still came down to a couple of guys who loved airplanes, giving up their Sundays to keep a piece of history alive.
Okay, we're looking good. Gotta come over this way.
Come this way just a little. I can spring it. Go ahead.
Right there.
Come on in.
Ben has managed to find not only parts for the airplane, but the support equipment needed to maintain it as well. Even an old dog-eared service manual is still providing guidance.
96 volts, 160 to 190 inch-pounds. Inch-pound. Got it?
And speaking of dog ears, yep, even the family pooch is called upon to help out.
Nowadays, of course, Sunday, I come up on a Sunday, I don't know, somebody else goes golfing, I guess. So it's a labor of love, of course.
Air shows are the stage where Ben gets a chance to do what he does best, giving thousands of people the thrill of seeing the fruits of his labor knifing through the sky. It's also payoff time for his volunteer crew.
They enjoy going to the air shows. Matter of fact, that's the only way I can afford to fly it, is take it to an air show, and they cover the fuels and some expenses. So it's enjoyable for all of us in that respect, so the work does pay off in some manner.
Of course, it's never just a matter of hopping in and going flying. There are always 1,000 details to take care of. Everything from what's the best way to tow the airplane.
When you put your wedge in here, you can move these all over.
Oh yeah, it swings, right.
If you pull your airplane without this being in,
you're going to move this and this.
If you turn this to such a degree, it'll break these here before it breaks anything else.
I didn't realize that. I thought it wiped out something.
To taking on fuel and getting hooked up to the start car. But finally, it's time to settle into the cockpit and put everything else out of the mind except flying the airplane. After all, this is what all the sacrifices were about. For the next few hours, it'll all seem worth it. slow and fast, thrilling the crowd with the speed and power of the Sabre. It's an unforgettable ride, no matter how many times you take the controls.
It gets quite exciting, especially you start pulling 4 or 5 Gs and working up a little sweat. It gets the adrenaline going. The airplane is really quite simple to fly. With the boosted controls, it's effortless, you might say. And I flew 51 quite a bit, and I just loved it. But after a few hours in the 86, you'll get spoiled in a hurry.
This is where the Sabre earned the spurs that command so much respect today. The skies over Korea. It was the first swept-wing fighter in the Air Force. Operational for just 1 year before the war broke out, the Sabres began shooting down MiG-15s within 1 day of their arrival in Korea. The stories of pilots in the 5th Air Force are now part of Air Force legend. The famous fighter sweeps to MiG Alley near the Yalu River coming to mind. In the first 6 months, Sabres downed 44 MiGs and damaged 77 with combat losses of only 6 F-86s. The kill ratio of Sabres remains among the highest of any American combat aircraft ever made. That record was very much on the mind of Ben Hall when he fought to bring this airplane to life.
The thing is, the 86 had a short life, just during the Korean War. But it was the first swept-wing fighter, and it first one to get in combat against, of course, the MiG-15. So I think it certainly deserves a place in history in that respect.
Now, when the air show is over and there's a bit of fuel left, perhaps there's time to pull up high and spend a few minutes alone with the airplane. Here there is a communion between man, machine, and the sky, a coming together that is difficult to describe.
Well, you can't describe it, I guess. How you got to explain to someone, when it's a certain feeling, you can say, boy, I don't know what you can say. You'd have to have them take a ride in an airplane to understand it. It's different.
And now it's time to bring the Sabre back to Earth. The experience of the pilot in the airplane combining in a truly graceful exhibition of how to do it right.
certain people are, when they're kids, they want to be a baseball player, or you know, they pick out something that they encounter something they enjoy. Well, when I was a kid, I don't know, 7 or 8, I was out building this crazy airplane. Of course, never flew. But and in 1936, I guess it was, I used to bicycle down to Boeing Field and wax the little cubs. So it was something just enthused me as a kid, and I followed it, fortunately, the rest of my life.
But soon this will be a rare sight for Ben and his friends. Their partnership born of adversity will be broken up. You see, after the many years of blood, sweat, and tears, Ben may have to give up his beloved Sabre.
It's not going to be easy when I do depart with it. But let's face it, I've had the aircraft almost 18 years now, and by golly, who can ask for anything more than that? I've really had and enjoyed it, and now it's time, I guess, to, might say, grow up. A little late, but and let somebody else younger take it, and I know they could have a ball with it.
But the memories will always stay. That glorious feeling of flying a legend, quiet and graceful, with the sun glinting off the canopy. That feeling will never be forgotten.
If I hadn't have got into this, what would I have done? Or what I've gotten into? Who knows? So this is the way it went, and I had a lot of fun.
An era is coming to an end. After 1987, the F-8 Crusader will no longer be a part of the active inventory of the Navy and Marine Corps. The plane they call the MIG Master is retiring after a career that is perhaps without parallel. The first shipboard supersonic day fighter is fading into history. And here's the story of how it all began. In the summer of 1952, the U.S. Navy issued an invitation to bid on the design and construction of a new fighter to be operational with the fleet in 1956. LTV, then known as Chance Vought aircraft, entered the competition and won. The concept was actually quite simple. Design the smallest and lightest possible airframe around the most powerful engine available. That engine turned out to be the Pratt & Whitney J-57 with 16,000 pounds of thrust. The XF-8U-1 began to take shape by late 1953. It emerged as a sleek and functional design that was years ahead of its time on many counts. For the first time, titanium and magnesium were extensively used, and the so-called Coke bottle fuselage was perfected in wind tunnel tests to reduce supersonic drag. For flight test, the airplane was disassembled for shipment to Edwards Air Force Base. It was towed to the loading area and placed on a C-124 transport. Soon it would take part in one of the most impressive initial flights in aviation history. A few days after it had left the factory, the airplane was in the final phase of reassembly. Among the systems being tested was the variable incidence wing. In the high position, the pilot was provided with excellent forward vision for carrier landings and a desirable angle of attack. The system worked well. Finally, late in the afternoon of March 24th, Chief Test Pilot John Conrad took the Crusader on its first taxi tests. With those tests completed, the 22 months of preparation were on the brink of culmination. Here now, the first flight of the XF-8U-1.
The date was March 25th, 1955, 1 week ahead of schedule. With test pilot Conrad again at the controls, preparation was made for the first flight of the XF-8U-1. On the ground, all performance data on the first and subsequent flights was recorded through a telemetering link. The information was carefully correlated for subsequent evaluation and study.
The Crusader had done it, exceeded Mach 1 on its first flight, and the milestones were only beginning. In 1956, a production F-8 set the first national speed record in excess of 1,000 miles per hour. Piloted by Commander Duke Windsor, this flight won the Navy its first Thompson Trophy. In 1957, the F-8 made 2 record-breaking transcontinental flights. One was an ocean-to-ocean flight made by Captain Bob Dosay and Lieutenant Commander Paul Miller from a carrier in the Pacific to one in the Atlantic in less than 3.5 hours. And then, Marine Corps Major John Glenn made the first supersonic crossing from L.A. to New York in 202 minutes. Finally, with the fleet, the Crusader set a milestone by joining operational squadrons within 2 years of its first flight. These days, it is often forgotten the F-8 gave rise to a second-generation aircraft called the Crusader III, bigger, faster, and meant to serve in the fleet interceptor role. Here is some rare footage of that airplane's first flight.
Clear to taxi to the east side of the lake bed. Line up with runway 25. Surface winds 260 at 15. Edwards altimeter 2994, over. This is Willie, roger out. Kingston Chase, this is Flight Willie, ready for takeoff. We'll release brakes on your signal, over. Kingston Chase to Flight Willie, roger. Turning into position, stand by for brake release. Okay, John, go. Here we go.
But the future did not hold the same promise for the Crusader III. It was competing against an airplane called the F-4 Phantom, and history records which aircraft won that competition. In the end, only 5 Crusader IIIs were built, and only 2 of those ever flew. Eventually, they were all scrapped, and perhaps only a few parts remain.
This is Edwards Tower, roger 340, clear to land on the lake bed at pilot's discretion. Winds 270 at 8 knots, altimeter 2994, over.
Despite the problems of its brother, the Crusader has seen a glorious career. In all, more than 5,000 naval aviators have flown the airplane. It earned the title MiG Master after shooting down 19 MiGs in exchange for only having 3 of its own shot down in air-to-air combat. And that is the best exchange rate of the Vietnam War. Today, this is the future of single-seat naval aviation. multi-mission aircraft like the F-A-18. And while few will dispute the Hornet's ability, many an old Navy jock will still think back to the early days of single-seat airplanes that were designed to fight other airplanes pure and simple. And they insist when you're out of F-8s, you're out of fighters.